out there on the market, and also increasingly new identity ones that can help in that regard.
So you're talking about credit verification, or like Vivo?
There are credits, but it's not really about the credit. It's also about the nature of the transaction that you're seeing, and what you can identify is where is it coming from, who does it represent. There are a number of variables. A number of technologies already do that today, but because that is now moving to like a PayPal, now it's now moving to Bitcoins, that those models don't scale. So there's still some work to be done in that regard. But there are credit risk checks are one thing. It's also about identifying, is this an anomalous transaction? Is it reflective of history? Do you have enough information to determine, is this the right person who it is? And there are identity solutions, there are fraud, sort of AML type solutions, all of those sorts of things come together, but it's still got a bit of white space. Sorry, I have to be vague.
Okay, thanks.
Can I just change the direction just a little bit? I'm interested from Frank and perhaps Kumar about the, Frank, you talked about the Australian Signals Directorate and its role as a government agency, but Mr Turnbull announced the sort of new super department recently, a couple of months ago now, I think. I found it mostly to be sort of media releases and not a lot of detail. To the extent that you've got some understanding of that, could you perhaps talk about that? And Kumar, perhaps if you're aware of how that's impacting the failure of government to be perhaps taking steps, and maybe that's a step in the right direction, I'd be interested to hear from you.
Yeah, it looks like, and details are still emerging, but it looks like one of the consequences of the reform that's being proposed is that the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, which in some sense was supposed to be a house to integrate what the Australian Federal Police were doing, what the Attorney General's
Talk up a
Department...
bit, sorry about
Pardon
that, I can hardly hear you.
Yeah,
Sorry.
let me press the button. So the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, which was really supposed to be an integration or fusion house of AFP, Australia Signals Directorate, and other sources of information in this space, looks like it will be moving to formally being under the Australian Signals Directorate. That is a change that in many respects may reflect a reality that's always been there, in the sense of the number of staff that are in that center, and Daniella may know more about the specific numbers, but as far as I can tell from the outside, let's say 3/4 of them have been ASD people, and then a smattering of folks from Attorney Generals and AFP and elsewhere. And so formal recognition of really ASD dominance, of what ASD is already dominant, may be one aspect of this new strategy. The good news is the proposed head of that stands to be very sophisticated and very aware of the concerns of industry in this space. And so in terms of individually, I have reasonable faith in that direction given the personalities involved. But institutionally and structurally, it is some source of concern. For example, there's potentially a global emerging norm that countries are not supposed to use cyber means to attack critical infrastructure in other countries or attack the cyber incident response teams of other countries. But again, as I suggested in my talk, if your cyber incident response team, your civilian cyber incident response team, is really an appendix upon an intelligence apparatus that is part of the Five Eyes, the legitimacy of claims of, we're something separate and therefore deserve and are not a valid target in the context of either armed hostilities or other forms of hostilities, becomes questionable, whether or not we're going to be able to honor that norm, or whether or not other states and actors in the space are going to be able to honor that norm with an increasingly formal and recognized role of the ASD, I think is a serious question. Again, that's not disrespecting or disliking the ASD, but recognizing at least how other actors may perceive, again, an intelligence agency that's part of the Five Eyes global network.
So what I would like to say again, I'll just giving you some practical examples. Last year, I attended a forum which was addressed by a 4-star general responsible for cybersecurity intelligence in the defense forces, senior executive from ASD, and a few other government leaders. And that was before the census attack. And what I said to them is the surveillance, intrusion, attacks, they don't just happen by state-owned enterprises that are on the opposite side of the fence. Some of these attacks are actually happening from our own allies, with whom we have defense treaties, trade treaties, and other sorts of arrangements. So I've asked them, why is the government not kind of taking action against some of these attacks, some of these intrusions? Because we would be spied upon by our own allies, which may come as a surprise to you on the internet. Okay, so as Daniel has pointed out, the protocols are still coming out as to what is acceptable and not acceptable. And right now, even within the governments, we are left to protect ourselves. And that's where I think the government has taken the right step of allocating $250 million after the census debacle to look at this, but that's only a beginning. So I think Australia needs to be very conscious that it is an independent nation responsible for its own security, and I think we need to be more serious than depend on others.
Thank you. We had some questions up here, and then we'll come back to
Maria McNamara from Hyperreal. I spent quite a bit of time with the Digital Transformation Office, and since coming out, we've been working with Paul Shepper and taking the temperature of boards to work out their readiness for transformation and their readiness to become digital companies. And our experience is exactly the same thing. It's that there isn't sufficient expertise around the board table, and there isn't sufficient acceptance around the board table, putting aside retail and financial services who have got their own existential threats to deal with, that they have to become digital companies with all that entails. That was a problem in 1996 when Nick Grider came out and challenged boards to acquire the digital skills that they needed. So my question is, what role does the University of Sydney, what role does the Warren Centre, what role does the BCA and the AICD have in equipping the people sitting around our tables with the skills that they need in order to manage the companies for the country to be able to sustain itself in a digital economy?
So just a thought that I would add to that is it's a really complicated space. So as a board member, you can imagine you need to have your head across a number of operational risks as well as where you're guiding the organisation strategically. So one could argue the same around climate change, whether you're a denier or not. So what we've done in Data 61 is that we've partnered with the AICD in this regard because, I mean, I did the course, I didn't find anything digital about it. And certainly from a cyber perspective, when it came to risk management, there really wasn't a recognition. And I think that's telling because if we're educating the next generation of directors or executive directors, that level of insight and knowledge needs to come to at that board level. It's tricky to assume that you can have that level of knowledge and insight by hiring someone who is cyber savvy or digital savvy. I think that takes years to actually have someone of that level. So we have to have a different approach, and particularly because there are boards that are in place and will be in place for quite some time before we get a next generation. And that doesn't necessarily mean we'll solve it by the next generation either. If we don't put in mechanisms to make them aware, ask the right questions. I think we need to do a better job of giving people a sense of what is actually cybersecurity, what are the questions to ask, and make sure that you have someone or people in your organization that can give you the answers, but you can challenge them. And it doesn't need to necessarily be at a technical level, but because you're managing the risk, but you're also managing the opportunity. So, and in my experience at board levels, I don't see that transition happening. I don't see them asking the questions. Expecting them to be cyber experts, I think, is a really big step. Maybe that'll take 2 generations because it'd just be as easy as saying, of course you need an accountant and a legal and expertise because there's just nothing else, right? Cyber will be one of those, but I think we've got a long way. I don't think we are equipping directors with enough knowledge about what is cyber, what are the questions to ask, what are the things to know when it goes wrong so you can course correct, and then knowing where to go to for help. Where do you bring that expertise in as and when required? I think there's a framework that we need to be educating that level more so. There is just too much at the moment that we leave to the media, with all due respect, to guide board decisions about what is cyber. In some respects, my colleagues actually are grateful for their compromises. And I know that sounds really terrible. We're grateful because it makes it real to people. And we said, we told you so. We just don't want to be the one in the paper. So I think we need to do a better job of communicating that knowledge in a simple way and providing frameworks so that boards can make those risk and strategy decisions and know where to go to for help. And actually it comes down to even a more basic. You're at the job of making sure your business is there for the future and it's resilient. Cyber is just an element of that. So how do you know? Have you tested it? Have you made sure that when something goes wrong, and if it's a cyber thing that actually generated that, can you get back? Do you know all of that? That I would have assumed is something you're already doing. It's just cyber is a means, and it's just a different language and some guidance.
I just want to add to that, and I completely agree with what Daniella has said. But and again, I've said this quite publicly, and I'm not concerned about what I'm saying. Australian boards have serious problems. I've done close to 22 or 23 board briefings in the last 3 years. I go around the boardrooms, I see the same faces. They're all selected from a club, I would say, which is informally a club, where they all come to know each other in the network. And when, as long as you belong to that exclusive club, you can become a board director. And if you don't belong to that club, and women had this challenge for a long time, gradually they're getting a little bit of success, you can't get into the boardroom. So we need to get out of that club mentality and get into what are the skills needed to run the business and have the right people on the board. I think that is the biggest challenge. No matter how much information we put in front of these people, if they're not interested, they're not interested. Okay, so other than preparing them and doing the right thing by governance, I think we also need to make sure that the right skills are available to drive. And sometimes those may be people who may not fit into the cultural, or the gender, or the age brackets that traditionally boards look for. And that is the challenge that boards need to address.
We might take a break for morning tea then. We've got a couple of questions, which if you can't grab the people during the morning tea, I'll look for you in this quick Q&A session in the next session. So with that, please thank our speakers. Frank,